morning, fresh people. Welcome to my living room. This was an unusual setup for me to give this talk. These are study sessions, and so our idea is to give you a review of everything you've been doing for the last 3 weeks in 50 minutes. So we'll see if we can cover this quite complex book in a fairly short amount of time. So the book in question is, of course, John Stuart Mill's On Liberty. It was published in 1859. And as you're just about to delve into E.O. Wilson's Consilience, you might find it helpful to keep in mind that there was another book written by some guy named Darwin that was also published in 1859. And that lets you know a little bit about what's going on in the larger culture, what kind of interest in human development and empirical investigation is really starting to become important, and to remind you of how John Stuart Mill plays a role in that, but is certainly not the only person investigating some of the kinds of themes that we're going to end up seeing in this course are important to the modern Western worldview. Another broad thing that is very important to keep in mind when we think about this text is that On Liberty is not at all the only thing John Stuart Mill ever wrote, not at all the only thing he is justifiably renowned for. He's also highly respected by philosophers, in particular, for having written a book called Utilitarianism, in which he talks about utilitarianism. And it's important to understand something of that particular moral philosophy in order to really get clear on some of the presuppositions that Mill uses to structure his thought in On Liberty. Utilitarianism, please, I'll bring you some coffee in a moment, make yourselves comfortable. Utilitarianism is the philosophy that we ought to act. We ought to act, so it's a moral philosophy. It's telling us how to be ethical. We ought to act to promote the greatest happiness for the greatest number of people. And this is very much in opposition to moral philosophies that say there are intrinsically right and intrinsically wrong acts. We don't need, according to these opposed moral philosophies, to think about the consequences of our behaviors. We need, according to these opposed moral philosophies, just to think about what God or reason is telling us is morally right in its own nature. Mill did not think that was the correct way to go about grounding our moral behavior or our political and social philosophy. He thought that we ought instead to think about the consequences on people's lives. We ought to think about how much happiness we promote. And so you may remember there is a passage where Mill says, I absolutely forego any advantage that might be gained for my view from abstract right. He is never going to say, I'm right because God says so. He's never going to say, I'm right because Plato says so, if that means anything to some of you yet. He doesn't think that there's anything intrinsically correct about the harm principle. He thinks instead that it is extrinsically correct. It's correct because of the positive benefits it promotes for people. So the positive benefits that he is interested in are happiness for the greatest number of people, and we probably ought also to spend a moment while we're at this kind of foundational level thinking about what he means by happiness. Because you could, if you were a hedonist, if you just liked having your nerve cells firing in a certain way, you could say, happiness is when I eat chocolate. Happiness is when I drink beer. That's not what Mill has in mind. Mill has a eudaimonistic approach to happiness, and that's an ancient Greek term, so it's probably not one you know how to spell. It's E-U-D-A-I-M-O-N-istic. E-U-U-D-I-D-A-I-M, dime, O-N-I-S-T-I-C. So he has a eudaimonistic approach to happiness. And what that means is he's not interested primarily in shallow pleasure. Instead, he's interested in the rich kind of human fulfillment that he, along with Aristotle, that's primarily who he's hearkening back to when he talks about eudaimonistic happiness. He's interested in the kind of rich human fulfillment that he and Aristotle believed we really wanted to experience in order to have the richest experience as a human being. He, Mill, and Aristotle thought we were most fully happy when we were developing friendships, when we were developing our aesthetic abilities, learning to sing, play the flute, read Dostoevsky. He thought that we were the most happy when we were developing our intellectual capacities, taking responsible self. So the more we come to understand what our potential is as a human being, there is something different about being a human being than being a dog or an aardvark. And what is it that is potential in me as a human being and not as an aardvark? I ought to find what that potential is and develop it. And when I develop it, I'll not only be making my mommy happy, thank God you did something with that expensive college education we paid for, I'll be making myself happy. I'll be much happier than I would be if I just sat around drinking beer. That might make me happy a little bit, but becoming a wiser, more emotionally and aesthetically and intellectually developed person will make me as happy as I can possibly be. In On Liberty, Mill wants to provide the maximum liberty possible for each person in his or her social setting so that they can pursue eudaimonistic development. Mill, again, does not think that there is some sort of intrinsic right from God that says you ought to be left free, you ought to have liberty. He thinks we need liberty in order to pursue that eudaimonistic development. If I am just put in a pre-programmed slot by my society, I'll never have the opportunity to develop my mental and emotional and aesthetic and other kinds of capacities. So he is trying to figure out how to leave me as free as I can be in a social setting. We are social creatures. That's something that Mill is really committed to. He doesn't think that we exist as separate little atoms, as though we were on desert islands and just accidentally run into people every now and then. He thinks we're powerfully socially shaped. And so how can you recognize our social nature and at the same time give us that developmental freedom that we need in order to experience our greatest happiness and for other people around us to experience their greatest happiness as well. The problem that Mill has is once you really recognize that we are in a social setting, it becomes much more difficult to figure out how logically and conceptually to provide us with that liberty. There's an example that Dr. Marina Morris likes to use when he talks about this, and because I'm not plagiarizing, don't want to plagiarize, I'm going to give him full credit for that. He says how nice it seems at first mental glance to think about being able to drive everywhere without having to stop for a stoplight. What a pain a stoplight is. I was going along at 65 miles an hour and now I have to hit the brakes. Wait for a long time, I could be cruising along. No, I'm sitting here at the stoplight. Total waste of time. So why don't we just let everybody drive anywhere they want to without any stoplights? Because we would die. We would die. We would crash into one another. Complete freedom in a social setting, not so cool an idea. If you're completely free to do anything you want to do, well, you might just feel like randomly sticking a knife in me. You've got the freedom, if we don't put any constraints on your behavior, to randomly stick knives in people. Well, that has a way of running up against my freedom. I would like to be able to develop myself without knives sticking out of me. So Mill has a real problem, and it's an important problem. It's one that all of us should care about, because we do value our social setting. We are social creatures. We need to respect that fact. And yet, there is also this important value of enabling us to develop freely. So how are we going to provide people with the greatest liberty possible while also at the same time respecting the need for some kind of social authority, some kind of social control? There has to be some rationale that enables us to set up the stoplights and probably other kinds of social control as well. Would it be so wonderful to live in a social setting without any military presence to protect us from a legitimate external threat? Would it be so wonderful to have no police to protect you from someone who's going haywire? Don't you want roads and public education, the sewer system? That seems like a pretty important one. So there are important benefits that we get from society and important ways in which society needs to exercise its authority.